All right. This is Charles Jeffreys, Professor Charles Jeffreys, Seattle Central College, Lifespan Development. And this is the second part. I'm talking about cognitive approach or cognitive theory of development. And we're talking about before, when you're talking about cognitive theory of development, two individuals come in mind, particularly Piaget. And like I said before, Piaget was heavily influenced by Maria Montessori. But like I said before, Piaget has his stages. You mentioned sensory motor, concrete operations, sensory motor, pre-operations, concrete operations, and formal operations. Also, Piaget said intellectual development runs parallel with physical development. As a child grows older and stronger and bigger and better coordinated, the child's ability to process information also improves. Okay, we talked about the stages. In other words, learning to deal with objects is a sensory motor stage, whereas learning to deal with symbols is a concrete operational stage, whereas learning to deal with thoughts and ideas is the main focus of your formal operations or adolescence. Okay, but think about that in terms of educators. Educators are very interested in Piaget's theory. I mean, if you plan to go and become a teacher in the K through 12 system, you'll read a lot about Piaget. Okay, so educators are very into at age-appropriate learning materials. At what age are you best to learn? Can you learn certain things? Okay, and we'll look at that Piaget's theory in detail, particularly it looks at the education. Okay, but think about that. Piaget in retrospect. Piaget in retrospect. He is one of the first people to interview children. Okay, he's talking about the clinical method, interview method. He was one of the first people to use the interview method on children. Okay, that was also educators are very interested in Piaget. And also Piaget, he actually attempted to use experimental conditions to a certain extent. Okay, where you interviewed kids. He was also used what we call the cross-sectional approach or cross-sectional research method. Cross-sectional means to interview different children at different ages or work with different people at different ages at the same time. Okay, looking at different people with different ages at the same time to a certain extent. In other words, you look at all his tasks. Conservation of liquids, conservation of solids. He's comparing 5-year-olds with 7-year-olds with 8-year-olds. So all these kids are the same task. Okay, that's what, and so as we're talking in terms of cross-sectional study. He invented kind of one of the people who came up with a cross-sectional study. Also, another thing of Piaget, he dealt with kids who did not have psychological problems. Okay, that's one thing that Freud, like I said, Freud never worked with children, and most of his theory was talking about pathology, how childhood experience set you up to be messed up. Erickson, he was a child psychotherapist, so he had to work with children directly, but he mainly worked with children who had psychological problems. Okay, whereas Piaget dealt with kids who did not have psychological issues. Okay. Next individual I'll talk about associated with the cognitive approach is Les Vygotsky. We'll spend a lot more time talking about Vygotsky, like I said, when we get into early childhood. Just right now, what I want you to remember about Vygotsky is that he talks about culture influences cognitive development. Culture influences cognitive development. He came up with two terms that I hear a lot even in the K through 12 system today. One is called scaffolding, another is called ZPD, zone of proximal development. Scaffolding is what really good teachers do, and we'll talk about that later on in the quarter as well. Really good teachers can scaffold. In other words, scaffolding means adjust your teaching styles to the needs of the student. Well, you don't get it this way, let me break it down and explain it a different way. That's what good teachers can do really well. They're really good at scaffolding. Okay, both my sons had a second grade teacher who was really good. She was a good teacher, but she's also good at scaffolding. We'll talk about that later on. Another thing, if you guys talk about zone of proximal development. In other words, what a child can do by himself versus what a child can do with a little bit of help. And you see that ZPD on your kids, at least in the Tacoma school, there's kids' progress report. You know, what you can do by yourself versus what you can do a little bit. That's what tutoring is all about. You know, you ever go to tutor and you just, I can't figure this out, and they show you one little thing and you just snap and got it like that. So in other words, just by that one little tutoring session, your zone of proximal development was expanding. Okay, so that was a cognitive approach. That was a cognitive approach. Like I said before, Piaget and Vygotsky, and the main thing you're looking at is intellectual development. In other words, how the child's ability to process information changes as he or she gets older. And like I said, when we get into childhood, and that's where Piaget's theory is the strongest, in early and middle childhood, and we'll spend a lot more time talking about Piaget then. Next theoretical approach we're going to talk about is learning approach.